Rest now, let your body grow calm, and let the quiet gather around you. For a little while, we'll drift quietly beneath the old stone halls of a long-sealed Abbey vault. If this brings you rest, subscribe, and there'll be a new one waiting tomorrow night. The floor of the undercroft at Revault Abbey sits nearly 2 meters below the level of the surrounding ground. To stand at the threshold of the Eastern Range passage is to stand at the top of a descent, the air changing before the body has fully committed to the step downward. A shift in temperature, a shift in the quality of the light, a shift in the particular quality of the silence that surrounds the place. The barrel-vaulted ceiling of dressed sandstone curves overhead in a continuous arc, each stone cut and placed with a precision that has held without settling for the better part of 800 years. The floor is worn smooth in the places where feet have passed, the stone polished not by any modern visitor, but by the cumulative passage of monks over the centuries, when the Abbey was a living community, and the smoothness of it beneath the foot has a different quality from any surface worn by sun and weather. It is the smoothness of enclosure, of a surface that has never dried out entirely, that has held the same cool moisture through every season since the first stones were laid into it. The air down here is not the air of the fields above. It carries a faint mineral note, something between damp limestone and old clay, the smell of rock that has not been warmed by direct sunlight in the better part of 9 centuries. And the silence is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a space that has been sealed against the noise of the world by several feet of earth and stone on every side, a silence with a particular density to it, the silence of deep containment rather than mere absence. Benedictine abbeys built between the 10th and 13th centuries were not structures that grew their underground spaces as afterthoughts. The excavation of cellars and undercroft passages into the bedrock of a site was part of the original architectural plan, a deliberate feature of the design, considered and specified before the first course of stone was laid above ground level. The walls of these buildings, reaching 3 to 5 feet in thickness, were not built merely for the support of the superstructure above. They were built with the intention of enclosure, of producing spaces whose integrity would persist across centuries, whose interior conditions would remain stable through seasons and generations in the slow turning of historical time. The subterranean passages at Battle Abbey in East Sussex, founded in 1070 on the site of the Battle of Hastings, demonstrate this with particular clarity. Passages cut into the living rock before the superstructure was raised above them, their barrel vaults and dressed stone linings surviving in largely original condition, their air still carrying the particular coolness of spaces that were designed from the beginning to hold things away from the warmth and change of the world above. To enter the undercroft at Revault is to understand something about the ambition embedded in medieval monastic building. The dressed sandstone ribbing of the ceiling curves overhead in a geometry that is both practical and beautiful, an engineering solution to the problem of spanning a space in stone without timber, and at the same time an expression of the care that was taken over spaces that would never receive a visitor of any ceremony or prominence. Undercrofts were not ceremonial spaces. They were places for the storage of the things that sustained the community, liturgical objects and financial records, and the physical material of an institution that expected to persist indefinitely. The beauty of the vaulting in these spaces was not incidental. It was a statement about the permanence of what was placed beneath it. Stone vaults, built to this specification, with rubble fill packed between the inner vault skin and the surrounding earth, were designed to last. The temperature inside them as a consequence of the insulating properties of that earth and rubble, remained stable through every variation of the seasons above, a steady coolness between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius, year upon year, decade upon decade, century after century, the ground above, changing from pasture to scrub to excavated ruin, and the temperature inside the vault not varying by more than a few degrees across the whole span of that change. The Abbey at Revolts was founded in 1132 by Cistercian monks from Clairvaux, and at the height of its prosperity in the 12th century, it housed a community of over 600 monks and lay brothers. It held extensive landholdings across the North Yorkshire moors, generated income from wool production on a substantial scale, and accumulated the liturgical wealth, the gold plate, the embroidered vestments, the illuminated manuscripts, the silver reliquaries. That was the material expression of an institution's spiritual authority and its standing within the wider world. The undercroft beneath the eastern range at Revolts was not merely a cellar in any informal sense. It was a secure architectural feature of a building designed to protect the institutional wealth of a community that understood itself as permanent. The floor level sitting nearly 2 meters below the surrounding ground surface was not an accident of construction. It was a deliberate placement, the result of an architectural decision to put the most secure space in the building as far below the surface as the geology of the site would permit. The barrel vaulted ceiling curving overhead, the dressed stone of the walls, the smooth worn floor. These are not the features of a space built in haste or in response to unforeseen circumstances. They are the features of a space built with intention and foresight by builders who expected what they made to last. Abbots of major English monasteries held a concentration of legal and financial authority that had few equivalents in medieval English society outside the great noble households. The abbot of a major house held exclusive legal authority over vast land holdings, in some cases covering territories that spread across several counties, and his authority extended to the management of gold plate, cash reserves, and relic collections, whose total value, in some instances, exceeded the resources available to smaller secular lords. The administrative records that survive from these institutions document this authority with a precision that reflects the seriousness with which the monasteries managed their own wealth. The obedientiary rolls of Westminster Abbey, accounts kept by the various officers responsible for specific aspects of the Abbey's administration, record in careful detail the movement of valuables between secure locations within the precinct. These documents survive on vellum, the Latin entries written in a practiced monastic hand, the columns of figures recording the transfer of gold plate between treasury chambers with the same calm precision that a modern institution might apply to the movement of funds between accounts. The ink on these entries remains legible. The vellum has been kept flat and dry for 700 years, filed and preserved, and now accessible to researchers who can read the handwriting and follow the transactions as they were recorded in the years when the Abbey was a living institution. What the obedientiary rolls show, among much else, is the routine nature of the management of monastic wealth, the movement of gold plate between treasury chambers, the authorization of access to secure storage, the recording of objects received and objects dispatched. These were administrative matters of sufficient regularity that they generated a consistent documentary record across generations of monastic officers. The abbot's authority over these transactions was not something exercised only at moments of crisis. It was a continuous institutional authority exercised through established procedures, documented in rolling accounts that were themselves kept in secure storage alongside the objects they described. To read these records is to encounter the infrastructure of a community whose relationship to its own wealth was practical, organized, and entirely deliberate. The gold plate existed, the secure chambers existed, the administrative procedures for managing both existed and were documented. The obedientiary rolls at Westminster are among the clearest surviving evidence that the wealth of major English monasteries was not simply accumulated and held passively, it was actively managed, moved within the precinct according to institutional need, and recorded with the kind of precision that reflects an expectation of long-term institutional continuity. That expectation of continuity was not fulfilled. Between 1536 and 1541, the commissioners appointed by Thomas Cromwell to carry out the dissolution of the English monasteries on behalf of Henry VIII moved through the religious houses of England and Wales with a systematic thoroughness that transformed the institutional landscape of the country within the space of 5 years. Their work was administrative in character, the compilation of inventories, the assessment of values, the transfer of properties and goods to the Crown, and the documentary record they generated survives in remarkable completeness among the records of the Court of Augmentations at the National Archives at Kew. These are not dramatic documents. They are the paperwork of an institutional process, folded parchment inventories, listing chalices by weight, investments by fabric, the handwriting of commissioners who walked through these places once and never returned. A gold chalice that had stood on the altar of an abbey church for 3 centuries appears in the inventory as a line of Latin and a number of ounces. A vestment embroidered in gold and silk thread over years of skilled labor appears as a description of fabric and an estimated monetary value. The objects that survive on the page as entries in an inventory are the objects that the commissioners found and recorded. The question of what they did not find, what was not on the table when they arrived, what was not in the treasury when they unlocked it, is a question that the inventory record cannot answer directly, but cannot entirely suppress either. The physical structures of dissolved abbeys were subsequently sold or demolished, stone by stone, in a process that proceeded at varying rates across different sites over the decades following dissolution. Some buildings were stripped quickly, their lead roofs removed, and their dressed stonework carted away for reuse in local construction. Others were converted to domestic use or repurposed for agricultural storage. Others were simply abandoned, their superstructures collapsing gradually over the following centuries as the mortar weathered and the roof timbers rotted and the walls lost their structural coherence without maintenance. What this process of demolition and abandonment did, in many cases, was seal the underground spaces of these sites beneath layers of collapsed masonry and accumulated soil, not with any deliberate intention of concealment, but as a simple consequence of the physical process of building collapse and vegetation growth. The undercrofts that had been excavated into bedrock before the superstructures were raised above them proved in many instances more durable than the buildings above them, while walls fell and roofs collapsed and floors were taken up and reused. The subterranean spaces of these sites continued to exist, sealed by the debris of the buildings above them, their temperature unchanged, their contents, where contents remained, preserved in the stable cool of a space that had, by accident rather than design, become permanently sealed. At Hales Abbey in Gloucestershire, dissolved in 1539, the process of post-dissolution investigation produced evidence that some of this sealing had been deliberate rather than accidental. Hales had been a house of some significance. It held the holy blood of Hales, a relic that had drawn pilgrims from across England and had generated substantial pilgrimage income for the Abbey over more than 2 centuries. Excavations conducted at the site in the early 20th century revealed sections of the northern cloister range that had been systematically blocked with mortared rubble. The blocking was not the work of later collapse or Victorian antiquarian investigation. The mortaring was careful, the stone courses neat, the blocking wall indistinguishable in technique from the original construction of the cloister range, a closure that had taken time and planning, and the kind of skilled craft that belongs to someone who built walls professionally, not someone filling a space in a hurry. The blocking at Hales was built to last. The corridor simply stopped, the passage ending in a neat wall of well-mortared stone, and beyond that wall, the space continued in darkness. To stand at a sealed wall of this kind is to encounter a particular quality of historical experience. The wall is not a ruin. It is not the result of neglect or decay. It is the result of a decision made by specific people at a specific moment for specific reasons to close a space permanently. The care visible in the mortaring is not the care of someone working without purpose. Someone chose these stones. Someone mixed this mortar. Someone fitted the courses with attention to their alignment, trimmed the face of the wall to sit flush with the surrounding stonework, and then walked away from it, leaving no written record of what they had done or what lay behind the wall they had built. The corridor simply stops. The passage ends in stone, and the absence of any written record is not an oversight. It is the point. A sealed space that is also documented is a space that can be found again. A sealed space that generates no record at all is a space that exists only for as long as the people who sealed it remember where it is. At Thornton Abbey in Lincolnshire, the relationship between sealed spaces and what they contained was made visible in a different and more direct way. 19th century investigations at the site found a bricked-up room containing skeletal remains and personal effects, evidence of a concealment whose nature and circumstances remained, after the discovery, unclear. What the Thornton discovery established was something simpler and more significant than any particular explanation of what had been placed in the room or why. It established that at English Abbey sites, deliberate concealment of spaces and their contents was not a theoretical possibility to be argued about from the documentary record alone. It was a documented archaeological reality. Rooms had been sealed. What was placed in them had remained there. The brickwork that closed them had held, and the contents had waited in the stillness behind it, unchanged, until the investigation that eventually opened the wall again. The combination of these two sites, Hales and Thornton, provides a kind of foundation for everything else. Not a foundation of legend or inference, but a foundation of documented physical evidence. At Hales, a passage was sealed with mortared rubble, the work carefully done, no record made of what lay beyond it. At Thornton, a room was bricked up, and its contents were preserved within it, until a later generation broke through the wall and found them. These are not stories. They are facts established by excavation and recorded in the reports of investigators who observed and documented what they found. The fact that something lies on the other side of a sealed wall at an English Abbey site, and that it may remain there for centuries without disturbance, is not a hypothesis that requires elaborate justification. It is something that has already happened at more than one site and been confirmed. The walls of Benedictine and Cistercian houses were not thin. The standard construction of major English monastic buildings between the 10th and 13th centuries produced walls of 3 to 5 feet in thickness, built from locally quarried stone, laid in lime mortar that hardened over decades into a material whose compressive strength exceeded that of the stone it held together. These walls were not built to a minimum specification. They were built by communities that expected their buildings to last indefinitely, and the structural evidence of that expectation is visible in every surviving undercroft, every intact vaulted passage, every section of wall that has persisted through 900 years of English weather without requiring replacement. The stone of these buildings is not simply old, it is old and still functional, still doing what it was built to do, still holding the curve of the vault, still maintaining the temperature differential between the interior and the ground above, still keeping the air inside at the same steady cool that it has held since the building was completed. The scale of the medieval monastic building program in England is easy to underestimate. At its height, in the 12th and 13th centuries, there were over 900 religious houses in England, monasteries, priories, nunneries, and friaries of various orders, ranging in scale from the great Benedictine houses, with their extensive precincts and multiple ranges of buildings, to smaller houses with more modest establishment. Even the smaller houses generated undercroft spaces, vaulted storage chambers, and the infrastructure of institutional wealth management. The great houses, Westminster, Canterbury, Glastonbury, Riavolks, Fountains, Bury St. Edmunds, were institutions of a scale that would have appeared remarkable, even by the standards of any other period of English history. Their precincts covered many acres. Their undercrofts ran for substantial distances beneath the eastern and western ranges. Their treasury chambers were built with the same care and permanence as the churches above them, designed to hold the accumulated wealth of communities that had been receiving gifts and bequests and pilgrimage income for centuries. At Battle Abbey, founded by William the Conqueror on the site of the Battle of Hastings as an act of penance for the dead of 1066, the subterranean passages that survive beneath the eastern range of the precinct were cut into the bedrock before the superstructure was raised. To walk through these passages today is to walk through a space whose original function and original condition have been preserved with remarkable completeness. The low barrel vaulted ceiling of pale Norman stone curves overhead at a height that requires attention to the top of the head. The floor is worn in the places where it has been most trafficked. The air carries the particular mineral coolness of rock that has not been warmed by sun in 9 centuries. And the walls on either side, cut into the living stone of the ridge above the valley, carry within their texture something of the patience that went into their making, the patience of craftsmen who understood they were building not for themselves, but for the generations that would come after them, for an institution that expected to persist indefinitely, and had no particular reason to believe that expectation was unreasonable. The dissolution of the monasteries ended that expectation with the speed and thoroughness of a single administrative decision. The commissioners arrived, compiled their inventories, assessed their valuations, and reported to Cromwell. The records they generated survive at Kew, folded and filed, and accessible to anyone who makes the request. The parchment inventories list their objects with the compressed efficiency of administrative documents that have no reason to be literary. A chalice is described by weight and material, in the presence or absence of a cover. A vestment is described by the type of embroidery and an estimated value. The commissioners who wrote these documents were not conducting an archaeological investigation. They were compiling an inventory of the assets of a dissolved institution for transfer to the crown. Their interest was in what was present and what it was worth, what was not present, what was absent from the treasury, what was missing from the chapter house, what had been removed from the undercroft before their arrival, generated notes in some cases, and silence in others, and in both cases left a gap in the record that subsequent investigation has only partially been able to fill. The lime mortar that held the walls of these buildings together was not a passive material. It was the product of a specific manufacturing process, the burning of limestone to produce quicklime, the slaking of quicklime with water, the mixing of the slaked lime with aggregates to produce a workable mortar, and its properties as a binding agent were well understood by the master masons, who specified its use, and the craftsmen who mixed and applied it. Lime mortar hardens by a process of carbonation, the absorption of carbon dioxide from the surrounding air over months and years following its application, and the mortar in the walls of surviving medieval buildings has been carbonating for centuries. What this means in practical terms is that the mortar in the walls of Rievaulx Abbey, or Battle Abbey, or Hales Abbey is not the same material it was when it was first applied. It is harder, it is more completely integrated with the stone it surrounds. It is, in some measurable sense, a stronger material than it was when the buildings were new. The walls that contain the undercrofts of these buildings are not weakening with age. They are within the limits of what stone and mortar can do, holding. The vaulted undercroft at Rievaulx represents one of the finest surviving examples of the kind of space that served English monasteries as the physical infrastructure of their institutional life. The barrel vaults of dressed sandstone, the floor sitting nearly 2 meters below the surrounding ground, the temperature held steady by the insulating properties of the earth above. These features describe a space designed not merely for storage, but for the long-term preservation of the objects placed within it. The monks who designed and built this space understood, without the benefit of modern materials science, that a stable temperature and a controlled moisture environment were the conditions required for the preservation of organic materials, wood, vellum, textile, leather, over extended periods. The undercroft at Rievaulx was not a cellar in any casual sense. It was a purpose-built preservation environment, constructed to institutional standards, designed to hold the material wealth of a community across generations. The stability of these spaces has been confirmed by the survival of the objects found within them. At sites where undercrofts have been opened under controlled archaeological conditions, investigators have found wooden objects, textile fragments, and manuscript materials preserved to a degree that reflects the conditions of the space rather than simple luck. Organic materials that would have decayed within years in an exposed environment have persisted for centuries in the stable cool of a sealed undercroft. The vellum of the obedientiary rolls at Westminster, kept flat and dry and away from light and moisture variation, remains legible after 700 years. The documents that were placed in secure storage within these buildings were placed there with the expectation that they would last. In many cases, that expectation was met. The sealed passage at Hales Abbey is a particular kind of evidence. It is not the evidence of a building that collapsed and sealed its own undercroft by accident. It is the evidence of a deliberate decision made by identifiable people at a specific historical moment to close a corridor and leave no record of the closure. The mortared rubble wall that blocks the passage in the northern cloister range was built with care, the stones fitted with attention to their alignment, the mortar applied with the precision of skilled craft. The people who built it were not in a hurry. They took the time to do the work properly. They built a wall that was meant to be indistinguishable from the original construction of the building, and in that ambition they largely succeeded. The blocking wall is not immediately distinguishable from the surrounding stonework. It is only on close examination, by someone who knows what to look for, that the difference in the stone fabric becomes apparent. The corridor simply stops. There is no door. There is no doorway. There is a passage that was, at the time of the original construction, a functioning part of the cloister range, and then at some point, a point that is not documented in any surviving written record, it became a wall. The passage ends in stone. The space beyond the wall continues in darkness. Its contents, if it has contents, undisturbed in the stable cool that has not varied significantly since the day the last stone was mortared into place. Whoever built that wall knew what lay behind it. Whoever walked away from it and left no written record of what had been done was making a choice about the persistence of that knowledge, choosing to carry it forward in memory rather than in documents, or perhaps choosing not to carry it forward at all, to let the wall stand and the darkness behind it remain undisturbed without any intention of return. The records of the Court of Augmentations at Kew hold the documentation of a process that moved through England with administrative thoroughness, recording what it found and transferring it to the Crown. The commissioners who compiled the inventories were not archaeologists and were not attempting to produce a complete account of what each site had ever possessed. They were recording what was present at the moment of their arrival. What had been moved, or sealed, or buried, or exported before that moment was not their concern and did not appear in their records, except as occasional notations of discrepancy. The folded parchment inventories in their archival boxes at Kew are as complete a record of the dissolution as any institution has a right to expect from an administrative process carried out under significant time pressure. They are not a complete record of what these houses possessed or where all of it went. The gaps in them are real, the silences in them are real, and the wall it hails with its careful mortaring and its neat courses of stone, with the corridor simply stopping and no document to explain the stopping, represents those silences in their most concrete and physical form, not an absence in a ledger, but an absence cut into the stone of a standing building, mortared shut with care, and left there without a word. The letter addressed to Thomas Cromwell from Furness Abbey's dissolution commissioners is held now among the papers at the National Archives, a folded sheet of faded ink on paper that has survived nearly 5 centuries in the kind of institutional quietude that preserves documents better than any deliberate effort. The handwriting at the top of the page is careful and formal, the address to Cromwell, rendered with the small courtesies of a letter written by men who understood whom they were writing to and why precision mattered. The date is April 1537. The commissioners are reporting on the voluntary surrender of Furness Abbey, the great Cistercian house in what is now Cumbria, whose abbot Roger Paley had come forward before the commissioners' arrival to offer the house into the king's hands. The tone of the letter is orderly. The business, at first reading, appears to have gone smoothly. Partway down the page, the register shifts. The commissioners record that upon their arrival, an inspection of the chapter house and adjacent treasury spaces, they found the contents to be fewer in number and lesser in weight than the complement described in the earlier episcopal valuation of the house's goods. The specific language they use is not dramatic. It is the language of men noting a discrepancy in an inventory, a gap between what a ledger says and what a room contains. The chapter house, they write, had already been disturbed before their arrival. Objects of unknown nature and quantity had been removed. The abbot Roger Paley, who had arranged the voluntary surrender and stood before them as a cooperative and willing participant in the process, was asked about this. His response is not recorded in the letter with any particularity. What is recorded is the commissioner's note that they were not able to account for the missing goods, and that they did not consider the matter sufficiently resolved to leave it without mention. The letter was sent, Cromwell received it, the matter was noted, no follow-up investigation into the missing goods at Furness is documented in the surviving record. What the commissioners encountered at Furness Abbey was not a unique situation. Across the years of the dissolution, which proceeded in waves through the late 1530s and into 1540 and 1541, the men appointed by the crown to assess, inventory, and take possession of monastic houses found again and again that the goods they encountered did not match the records that had preceded their arrival. The letters and papers of Henry VIII, the vast administrative archive of the reign that survives in multiple repositories and has been extensively calendared and indexed by later scholars, contains the correspondence of many commissioners writing to Cromwell from many different houses across England and Wales, and among those letters are recurring variations on the same observation. The plate is less than the valuation said it would be. The treasury is lighter than the episcopal record suggested. The sacristy, the chapter house, the abbot's lodgings, the rooms have been visited before the commission arrived, and what was in them is no longer fully there. The commissioners who wrote these letters were not credulous men. They were administrators appointed to perform a legal and financial function for the crown, and their correspondence reflects a professional attentiveness to discrepancy. When they noted that goods were missing, they were doing so as part of a formal report on the condition of a surrendered house, not as storytellers interested in the mystery of where things had gone. The observation was practical. The plate is missing, the treasury is lighter, the chapter house was disturbed. These are the notes of men running an inventory, finding the columns do not add up, and writing it down. The weight of what they were writing about requires a moment to settle. English monasteries, by the time of the dissolution, had accumulated centuries of wealth in forms that were both physically concentrated and highly portable. Gold and silver liturgical plate, chalices, patens, ciboria, processional crosses, altar plates, censers, candlesticks had been donated by successive generations of pious benefactors, commissioned by abbots of means, and acquired through gift and bequest across spans of time that in some cases exceeded 400 years. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral Priory had generated pilgrimage income in the early 14th century on a scale that exceeded the combined annual revenue of some smaller abbeys, income that had been converted into gold and worked silver and precious stones over decades of careful patronage. Reliquaries, small and large, made from gilt copper and from solid gold, set with garnets and sapphires, and with stones whose names the commissioning abbots would have known, and that later inventories record only generically as a great stone or divers small stones of colors, were among the most valuable single objects a monastery could hold, and the most portable. Beyond the reliquaries and the plate, there were the vestments, gold-embroidered chasubles and copes, some representing the labor of many years of needlework in the tradition of opus Anglicanum, English work, the medieval embroidery, so fine and so technically demanding that it was sought by the courts of Europe and by the papal curia, were objects of extraordinary monetary value as well as religious significance. And beyond the vestments there were the manuscripts, some plain and functional, some illuminated with beaten gold leaf and ground lapis lazuli and pigments that still retain their color after 7 centuries, objects whose value in the dissolution inventory was counted in the weight of their metal fittings and binding clasps, because the commissioners had no framework for assessing the value of the images inside them. And behind all of this, there was money. English abbeys operated as financial institutions, as well as religious houses, holding cash reserves and lending money, and receiving rent from vast land holdings across multiple counties. And the cash in a major abbey's treasury at any given time represented only the visible portion of a financial infrastructure that ran deeper into ledgers and deeds and legal instruments recording centuries of accumulated land tenure. All of this was what the Crown's commissioners were arriving to take, and some of it, in house after house, was not there when they arrived. The shortfall at Glastonbury Abbey is the most thoroughly documented of these discrepancies, and it is worth staying with it for a moment, not because it is the most dramatic case, but because the surviving record around it is more extensive than most, and because the scale of the house involved gives some sense of what a major monastic treasury actually held. Glastonbury by the 1530s was the wealthiest monastic house in England, its annual income exceeding £3,000 at a time when a skilled craftsman might earn £5 or £6 in a year. The abbey had been accumulating land, plate, relics, manuscripts, and cash since its refoundation in the late 9th century. Its abbot Richard Whiting had governed the house since 1525. The site's prestige, its antiquity, and the complexity of its finances made it a significant target for the dissolution. Commissioners Richard Leighton and Thomas Moyle were assigned to Glastonbury. Their letters to Cromwell from this period survive, and in them they report finding plate deliberately concealed by Abbot Whiting. The nature of the concealment and the precise location where the commissioners claim to have discovered it are described, though later historians have raised questions about the procedural regularity of the investigation and about the degree to which the accusations against Whiting were constructed to justify an outcome already determined. What is not in dispute is that the commissioners reported finding hidden goods, that Whiting was subsequently arrested, that he was tried, and that on the 15th of November 1539, he was executed on Glastonbury Tor. The Tower of St. Michael at the summit of the Tor is visible for miles across the Somerset levels, a landmark above the flat country that surrounds it, the abbey he had governed lying in the valley below. What had been sealed or hidden before the commissioners' arrival at Glastonbury, and where it was placed, is a question the historical record does not resolve. The vault attributed to his abbey has not been located. Whiting's case illustrates something about the broader pattern of dissolution-era concealment that the documentary record makes visible only in its outlines. An abbot who knew the commissioners were coming, and by the later years of the dissolution, it was not a matter of uncertainty, faced a decision about what to do with the portable wealth of his house. The formal cooperative path was to surrender everything listed in the valuations, to hand over the plate and the reliquaries and the vestments and the cash, to cooperate fully with the inventory process, and to accept the pension offered in return for the house's goods and lands. Some abbots took this path, others did not. The correspondence of the commissioners, read across many houses and many counties, suggests a third category, abbots who cooperated formally while ensuring that not all of the house's wealth was available to be inventoried, who had the goods moved or concealed before the commissioners arrived, and who presented themselves as willing and cooperative parties, while the rooms behind them held less than the records said they should. This is the behavior the Furness commissioners noted and the Glastonbury commissioners accused. It is the behavior implied by the shortfall letters, the discrepancy reports, the careful notations that the treasury was found partially emptied. The pattern across multiple sites establishes something the commissioners themselves articulated in writing, that the movement of valuables before the arrival of dissolution inventorying teams was a practice sufficiently common to be formally noticed and recorded as a category of problem. Not a single accusation against a single abbot, a pattern across the dissolution record as a whole. Norton Priory in Cheshire offers a different kind of evidence. The Priory, an Augustinian house dissolved in 1536, was excavated extensively in the latter half of the 20th century, and the excavations revealed a coin hoard deposited in an earthenware vessel beneath the chapter house floor. The vessel had been placed in a location that archaeologists identified as inconsistent with normal depositional patterns. Inconsistent, that is, with the kind of casual loss or inadvertent burial that accounts for many coin finds on medieval sites. The depth and placement of the vessel and its location within a space that would have required deliberate access to reach pointed to intentional burial rather than loss. Someone had taken the vessel, filled it with coins, carried it into the chapter house, lifted a section of floor, placed the vessel beneath it, and replaced the floor above it. The vessel was found during excavation. It had been there since the medieval period. The excavation report gives the dating evidence and the deposit's context in the careful technical language of field archaeology, without flourish, because the fact itself requires nothing added to it. Someone buried a pot of coins under the chapter house floor, and it stayed there, undiscovered for several centuries, until the excavator's tools reached the right depth and found it. The coins were a hoard. They were not the only thing buried at Norton Priory, in all probability, because a hoard of that kind represents a portion of whatever was available to be buried, not necessarily all of it. Plate and reliquaries, which were bulkier and heavier, required different solutions. The coin hoard at Norton says something about the practice without exhausting the question of where the rest of the missing goods went. A document from the inventory of Furness Abbey, preserved in the Court of Augmentations, records offers another angle on what the commissioning process encountered in the later years of the dissolution. The Court of Augmentations was established in 1536, specifically to administer the revenues and properties flowing to the crown from dissolved monasteries, and its records, which survive in the National Archives, constitute one of the primary sources for understanding what the dissolution inventories actually found. The Furness inventory is among these records. It notes with the same flat administrative precision as the commissioner's letter that the treasury was found partially emptied, that voluntary surrender had preceded the commissioner's arrival, and that objects of unknown nature and quantity had been removed from the chapter house. The phrase unknown nature and quantity is worth sitting with. It means the commissioners did not know what had been in the chapter house before it was disturbed. They could observe the absence. They could not describe the contents of the absence. This is the structural problem with dissolution-era concealment as a historical subject. The record preserves the shape of the gap rather than the contents of what filled it. A letter says the treasury is lighter than the valuation suggested. A letter says the chapter house was disturbed. An inventory column records a described item and then notes no receipt. The documents are meticulous about the absence without being able to describe what the absence contains, because the information about what was concealed went with the objects that were concealed, into spaces that the commissioners never found. The inventory column is the most persistent and quietly significant document form in this whole body of evidence. Dissolution inventories were structured as lists: item described, weight or quantity noted, date received noted, receiving official's name noted, and when an item was listed in a valuation but not found in the physical inventory of a surrendered house, it generated a blank in the receipt column. The item is described. The column for receipt is empty. No later document explains the blank, because the explanations for most of these blanks were made in conversations, in gestures, in the arrangements made between abbots and trusted laymen in the weeks before the commissioners arrived. Arrangements that were never written down, or that were written down in documents that did not survive. A gold chalice listed in a commissioner's inventory as parcel gilt with a cover and given a weight in ounces is an object that existed in the record long before the chalice itself disappeared from whatever room it had occupied. The weight is precise, the description is functional. A later hand may have added a note in the margin, or the column may simply be blank, or the document may contain only the description and the weight and then stop, the rest of the accounting unrecorded, because the object was never presented to be received. The chalice in the record is a trace of an object that was somewhere, that someone moved, that went into a concealed space, or across the sea, or into private hands, and is now somewhere the record does not reach. There are thousands of these entries across the dissolution inventory records. The question of what was hidden, as distinct from what was sold off, exported, or simply stolen by individual monks or laymen during the disruption of surrender, is one that the historical record cannot answer with precision. The distinction matters because sold and exported goods can in principle be tracked through later records. An object that entered the market leaves a documentary trace, however faint, whereas an object deliberately concealed and sealed into an inaccessible space leaves no trace at all beyond the blank in the column that marks its absence from the receiving inventory. The commissioner's letter about Furness noted the discrepancy and moved on, because there was nothing to be done about it at that point, and many other houses to visit and inventory. The pattern of missing goods across multiple houses was something Cromwell and his administrators were aware of from the correspondence, and it informed later instructions to commissioners about searching more thoroughly and arriving without prior announcement where possible. The administrative response to the pattern of concealment was more rigorous procedure. It did not recover what had already been concealed. The correspondence preserved in the letters and papers of Henry VIII includes, among the many commissioners' letters, several that go beyond the simple notation of discrepancy to describe the specific nature of what was found to be missing or the specific location where suspicious concealment was observed. These letters are not the majority of the dissolution correspondence. Most commissioners' letters are straightforwardly administrative, but they are frequent enough to establish that the phenomenon of deliberate pre-arrival concealment was a recognized and recurring feature of the dissolution process, observed by the commissioners in their own professional capacity and articulated in their own words. One of the more telling aspects of these letters is that the commissioners did not, in general, search the physical fabric of the buildings with any thoroughness. Their purpose was to inventory goods that were accessible and then to arrange for the disposal of the building itself through sale, demolition, or conversion. The systematic physical investigation of Abbey structures, including their underground spaces, was not part of the commissioner's brief. They walked through rooms that were open to them. They received what was handed over. They noted what appeared to be missing from the record. They did not excavate. This is a structural feature of the documentary record that has important implications for what the record can and cannot establish. The commissioner's letters document the surface of the concealment pattern, the missing goods, the disturbed chapter houses, the lighter treasuries, but they say nothing at all about the spaces where the concealed goods were placed, because the commissioners never reached those spaces. The record goes quiet, precisely at the point where the most significant information would have been, because the men with access to that information, the abbots, the obedientiaries, the trusted laymen who helped move the goods, either kept silent, died taking the knowledge with them, or wrote things down in documents that did not survive. What the record shows is the outline of a large-scale and geographically dispersed pattern of deliberate concealment carried out in the period immediately preceding the dissolution of each house, leaving gaps in the inventories that the Crown's commissioners observed, noted, partially investigated, and in most cases could not resolve. The scale of English monastic wealth makes the material significance of this pattern considerable. Even a fraction of the goods that appear to be missing from dissolution inventories across the full body of surviving records would represent, if gathered together, an extraordinary accumulation of worked gold, silver, gem-set reliquaries, and other portable wealth. The lacunae in the record are not a minor feature of the dissolution archives. They are a systematic presence. They appear in the records of major houses and minor ones, in correspondence from commissioners working across different regions, in inventory documents from different years within the dissolution period, in the letters of men who had no particular reason to be interested in one another's reports. The pattern is large enough and consistent enough that it cannot be attributed to error or to the natural losses that attend any large-scale administrative process. The commissioning teams were experienced administrators who were specifically looking for the goods the valuations said should be present. When they noted a shortfall, they were noting it because the absence was real and they had looked for what was missing and had not found it. The blank receipt column in the dissolution inventory is in a sense the most honest document in the archive, and it records exactly what the commissioners encountered, an item that should have been there, described with the precision of a professional inventory, and then not present when the room was entered and the contents counted. The described item is in the ledger. The receipt entry is empty. The ledger was closed and filed. The ledger was kept, because ledgers are kept, because the administrative structures of the Tudor state preserved their records with the thoroughness of institutions that understood the legal and financial value of documentation. The ledger sits in the archive. The blank column has been sitting in it for nearly 500 years. What the blank means, where the described object went, who moved it, into what space it was placed, whether that space was sealed and how, and whether the space and what it held have survived, is a question that the receipt column raises and does not answer. The receipt column simply stops. The space after the item's description is empty. Someone knew what that empty space meant. Someone knew what was on the other side of the accounting gap, knew the name of the room, or the passage, or the sealed vault where the described object had been placed, knew the route by which it had been carried there, and the hands that had carried it. That knowledge did not make it into the written record. It traveled by other means, or it did not travel at all, resting in the understanding of the people who held it, and then resting in no understanding anywhere. The knowledge dissolved along with the institution that had produced it, the people who had carried it, gone in their own time, the spaces they knew about, sealed and patient beneath their weight of stone and earth and centuries of accumulated silence. The letter from the Furnace Commissioners sits in the National Archives. The Glastonbury Inventory sits in its repository. The Norton Priory coin hoard has been excavated, recorded, and described in the archaeological literature, and the hollow where the earthenware vessel sat has been refilled, and the floor above it relaid, and the surrounding stones carry no visible trace of what was found beneath them, because the stones were never aware of it. The records of the Court of Augmentations fill many folded parchment sheets with the careful handwriting of clerks who walked through these places once in the course of their official duties and wrote down what they found and what they did not find, and then moved on to the next house and the next inventory. The blank columns persist through all of it. Described items, empty receipts, the accounting suspended at the precise point where an object ceased to be visible to the men who were looking for it, and entered the category of the gone and unrecorded, which is a category with no column in any dissolution inventory, because the administrative structure of the Crown's commissioning apparatus had no framework for what is absent in a space that cannot be entered. The ledger was closed. The blank was filed along with everything else, because that is what is done with a ledger. It is closed and kept. The blank column as permanent and legible as the entries around it, the absence given its own kind of documentary existence by the fact that the entries on either side of it survived. Whoever drew the blank column into that ledger, ruling the line and leaving the space empty because there was nothing to write in it, was recording something real. The entry describes an object. The empty space records that the object was not there. The ledger held them together in the same document. The ledger still does. The temperature dropped 4 degrees at the threshold. That detail appears in the site notes from the 2004 investigation at Netley Abbey in Hampshire, a single line of measurement recorded in a field notebook, precise and without comment, the kind of observation that accumulates in a working archaeologist record without ceremony. 4 degrees, the difference between the air of the excavated access tunnel and the air of the chamber on the other side of the opening. A difference small enough that it would pass unnoticed on any ordinary afternoon outside, in sunlight, with the warmth of the surrounding landscape doing its work on everything within reach. In a stone passage several meters below the surface of the ground, with the dressed rubble of an 800-year-old wall newly opened in front of the investigation team, 4 degrees was not a small difference. It was a condition. It was the record of a space that had been effectively sealed for a very long time, holding its temperature steady while the seasons turned above it, accumulating the particular atmosphere of enclosure, the chemistry of a room that had been breathing nothing but itself since the last person left it, and the last stone was set into the wall behind them. The investigators noted the temperature drop, and they moved through the threshold, and they noted the air. The quality of it is described in the site notes in terms of measurement rather than sensation, as a professional account should be. But the measurements carry their own kind of information. Carbon dioxide elevated, oxygen concentration depressed. The atmosphere of a sealed space is not simply cool and dark. It is chemically distinct, the product of the slow metabolic processes of the microorganisms within it, the decay of organic materials at the pace permitted by the stable temperature, the absence of the gas exchange that takes place continuously in any space connected to the outside world. The air inside the Netley chamber had not been exchanged. It had sat in the barrel vault of the ceiling and in the corners of the rectangular floor and against the walls for however many years had passed since the last stone was mortared into place at the entrance, and it had become, over that time, something measurably different from the air outside. The investigators recorded this and moved carefully forward into the space and recorded what they found. The vault itself was approximately 3 meters by 4, a rectangular room, not large, the dimensions of a comfortable study or a small storage space, the kind of room that does not announce itself even when it is open and lit and occupied. In the dark, sealed for an extended period, it would have been simply an absence in the stone, a space the surrounding material went around and did not fill. The walls were intact, the lime mortar between the stone courses having hardened over the decades since construction into a matrix of considerable compressive strength, the material that medieval builders chose for their underground work, not because of any particular sophistication, but because the chemistry of lime mortar in contact with damp stone over a long period, produces a bond that approaches the strength of the stone itself, filling the spaces between courses and pressing outward against the surrounding earth with the patient force of material that has had centuries to set. The floor of the Netley chamber was undisturbed. The ceiling curved overhead in the ribbed barrel vault form that medieval masons applied to underground spaces throughout the period of major English monastery construction, the arch distributing the load of the earth above it, outward and downward into the walls, which pressed their load into the bedrock below. The whole structure holding its curve in the dark for as long as the mortar held, and the stone held, and the earth above it remained reasonably stable. At Netley, all of these conditions had held. Medieval underground vault construction began, always, with the quarrying of local stone. At a Sidarjan house in Yorkshire, the vault chamber would be cut from millstone grit or carboniferous limestone, the same material the abbey above it was built from, drawn from the same local bed, shaped by the same craftsmen who dressed the stone for the walls of the cloister range. In the southern counties, chalk or greensand. In the Midlands, the oolitic limestone that has been taken from the Cotswold beds since the Romans first recognized its workability. The specific geology of a site determined the character of its stonework, and by extension, the character of any vault chamber cut or built beneath it. The color of the walls, the texture of the dressed surfaces, the particular way the torchlight moved across the cut faces of the blocks, in the moments after an opening was first made. Each site had its own stone, its own mineral note, its own quality of cool, limestone carrying a different temperature signature from sandstone, chalk holding moisture in a different pattern from hard igneous rock, each material giving back the air around it, something specific to itself. The Undercroft Passage at Revaults Abbey in North Yorkshire, where the eastern range floor sits nearly 2 meters below the surrounding ground surface, is dressed sandstone, the ribbing of the barrel vault cut, and fitted with the care that Sister Bilti consistently applied to its structural work. The stone there is the color of pale amber in strong light, and the color of shadow in low light, and the temperature it maintains, a steady cool of between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius, consistent across every season, is the temperature of the earth at that depth, conducted through the stone from the surrounding bank of ground, and held there without variation. That temperature has not changed appreciably in 800 years. The thermal stability of medieval vault chambers was not a designed feature in the sense of a written specification. No surviving architectural record describes the insulating properties of a rubble-filled earth bank as a deliberate choice. The builders understood, through accumulated practice, that underground storage held temperature steady, and that steady temperature preserved grain, preserved wine, preserved the wax of candles and the oil in lamps, preserved the leather of bindings and the fabric of vestments. The preservation of liturgical objects and documents was a practical necessity that the architecture served without needing to theorize about its own mechanisms. A chalice in a ground floor vestry was subject to the cold of winter and the relative warmth of summer, the variation in humidity that came with each season, the movement of air through spaces that were used daily and opened regularly to the outside. The same chalice in an undercroft chamber, sealed behind an oak door and set within a rubble-insulated stone vault, was sitting in a thermal environment that barely distinguished one month from the next. The cold of January and the warmth of July passed overhead without reaching it. The dry air of a summer drought and the damp of a wet autumn pressed against the sealed walls and were held there. Inside, the temperature varied by perhaps 2 degrees across the year. The humidity remained at whatever level the stone and the mortar and the contents of the chamber had established between them. The air turned and turned on itself without exchange, and the objects within sat in conditions that inadvertently replicated the most controlled modern storage environments, not by design, but by the simple physics of sealed stone below a sufficient depth of earth. The doors that controlled access to these spaces were built to outlast their makers. An oak door fitted to an undercroft passage in the 13th century was made from timber that had already been standing for 100 years or more. The slow-grown heartwood of mature English oak, dense and close-grained, a material that once properly seasoned and fitted into a frame would serve for several human lifetimes without replacement. The door fittings visible on surviving examples at Wells Cathedral and in the undercroft of Lincoln Cathedral demonstrate this with a directness that no written account quite matches. The metal still shaped, and the oak behind it still present, the form of the whole assembly still legible after 8 centuries. The iron straps that reinforced these doors were wrought from local metal by smiths working in the tradition of practical structural metalwork, each strap hand-forged to the dimension of the door it was fitted to, the fixing bolts set into the oak with the weight and deliberateness of work intended to resist not convenience, but time. These doors were not made to be moved often. They were made to hold. The locks fitted to major monastic vault doors operated on the lever tumbler principle, a technology already well established in English building practice by the 13th century. The mechanism required a matching key to lift a series of iron levers to precise individual heights simultaneously, so that the bolt which ran through all of them could be drawn clear. A lock of this kind, correctly made and maintained, did not yield to an incorrect key. The levers would not rise in the right sequence without a key cut to the exact profile of the lock's interior, and the profile of each lock was unique to the smith who made it. The key itself was a substantial object, heavy in the hand, the bow at one end and the bit at the other shaped to correspond exactly to the internal geometry of its lock, a piece of precision metalwork produced with the understanding that the security of what lay behind the door rested on the relationship between these two objects. The keeper of the key held, in the most physical sense, the authority over what was stored. At major Cistercian houses, that authority was divided. The customary of Bury St. Edmunds records a practice in which high-security vault spaces were secured by 2 separate locks, each requiring its own key, each key held by a different monastic officer. The sacrist held one key. The sub-prior held another. Neither could open the vault alone. To access the stored contents, both officers had to be present, both keys had to be applied, both locks had to be opened in the correct sequence, a system that ensured the movement of valuables from the most secure storage was a witnessed, authorized, institutional act rather than a private one. The practical implications of this arrangement extended beyond the immediate security of the objects inside. It meant that any record of vault access existed not only in a ledger, but in the memory of 2 separate individuals, and that the concealment of any movement of objects would require the cooperation, or at least the silence of both. 2 keys, 2 officers, 2 locks, each set into the face of an oak door, reinforced with wrought iron straps, the whole assembly fitted into a stone arch at the entrance to a barrel-vaulted chamber, 2 meters below the surface of the surrounding ground. The system was not complicated. It was thorough. The rubble fill that surrounded the inner skin of a vault chamber was not passive packing. Archaeological cross-sections from sites where vault chambers have been systematically excavated show this material in the detail that only a drawn section can provide. A dense gray layer, labeled and measured, the particle size recorded, the composition noted, the relationship between the fill and the surrounding earthen bank established. The fill was typically composed of the waste material from the construction of the vault itself, chipped and broken stone from the dressing of the vault blocks, raked lime mortar from the setting of the courses, fragments of ceramic and occasional pieces of timber, the domestic debris of a construction site packed into the space between the finished stonework and the cut edge of the earth as the work proceeded. This material, packed with some care and then left for decades, compressed under its own weight and under the pressure of the surrounding earth into a layer of considerable density. It was this layer that provided the thermal barrier between the vault interior and the seasonal temperature variations of the surrounding soil. It was this layer that, in combination with the lime mortar of the vault skin, gave the chamber its long-term stability. And it was this layer, visible as a clean boundary in the archaeological section drawing, that indicated to the investigators examining the record that the vault had been built to last. At Byland Abbey in North Yorkshire, late 20th century excavations in the South Range subfloor identified a section of blocked passage where the blocking wall had been built with an unusual urgency. The evidence for this urgency was not in the mortar. The mortar was set correctly, the joints filled, the face of the blocking wall flush with the surrounding passage stonework. The evidence was in the material used to fill the wall's interior. Pressed into the mortar between the facing stones were reused decorative floor tiles of a type produced between approximately 1250 and 1340. Their glazed surfaces face down in some places and face out in others. The geometric patterns that had once formed a coherent floor design, now serving as structural fill in a wall built in haste. The tiles had been lifted from a floor surface somewhere within the Abbey precinct. The character of the glaze and the clay body was consistent with Cistercian production of that period, and incorporated into the blocking wall as the nearest available material, not the measured choice of a construction project planned in advance, where the builder would have prepared the appropriate rubble fill and brought it to the site. The choice of someone with access to a floor and to tools for lifting floor tiles and to mortar and to a limited amount of time. The blocking wall at Byland was built with competence and care. It was also built quickly with whatever came to hand, and the tiles embedded in its interior are the record of that particular combination of skill and urgency. The sealed passage at Byland leads on its far side to a space that had not been opened as of the date of the excavation report. The blocking wall was recorded, photographed, described in section and in plan, and its construction materials were analyzed and dated. The tiles established the earliest possible date for the blocking as post 1250 and suggested, given their use as waste material rather than floor surface, that the blocking had taken place after the floor they came from had been lifted and the tiles had been available as loose material, a sequence consistent with the period of the Abbey's dissolution, when floor surfaces were sometimes deliberately lifted and their materials redistributed to prevent easy identification of their original location. The wall was recorded, and the passage on its far side was noted as inaccessible, and its contents were not described, because there was nothing to describe from direct observation. The investigation reached the wall, and the wall held. It had been holding since the day it was built. The oak door at the inner boundary of a sealed vault chamber, where one survived the centuries in sufficient condition to be examined, told its own history in the material of the wood. Oak of the age appropriate to major English monastery construction, 13th century, 14th century, had been seasoned before use to a degree that made it dimensionally stable, resistant to the expansion and contraction that affected less carefully prepared timber. In the stable temperature of a sealed undercroft, the seasoned oak of a vault door would not warp. It would not crack along the grain from the cycling of damp and dry air that was responsible for the deterioration of timber in exposed conditions. It would simply continue to hold its shape in the darkness, the iron straps across its face holding their shape against it, the lock plate set into its edge, maintaining the geometry of the keyhole with the precision of undisturbed metal in an undisturbed frame. The door, in conditions of sealed stability, was the same object it had been on the day it was hung. The lock required the same key, the same two keys if the vault had been fitted with a double locking system. Somewhere, presumably, the keys had gone, carried out by the last officer to leave, passed to a trusted hand outside the precinct, buried somewhere in the precinct ground, lost in whatever sequence of events attended the last days of the house. The door remained, the lock remained, the sealed air remained on the far side of both. What is preserved inside a sealed vault chamber of this age is in large part determined by the character of the objects placed within it and the specific atmospheric conditions that developed in the sealed space over time. Gold and silver plate, for instance, the liturgical vessels that featured in every major monastic treasury, survive indefinitely in sealed conditions. Gold does not corrode, silver tarnishes, darkening to a deep black over years, but the object beneath the tarnish is intact, its form unchanged, its weight the same as the day it was placed in the vault. A chalice sealed in a stone chamber in 1539 would, if the chamber remained sealed and the temperature and humidity remained stable, be recoverable from that chamber today in the same form, the tarnish on the silver strippable, the gold bright as the day it left the metalsmith's hand. The vellum of an illuminated manuscript is a more conditional preservation. Vellum is animal skin, calf skin, or sheepskin, and its survival in a sealed environment depends on the initial moisture content of the vault, the degree to which the humidity had stabilized before the sealing of the chamber, and the absence of the biological agents, mold, bacteria, insects, that would otherwise accelerate its deterioration. In conditions of stable, cool humidity, well-seasoned vellum can survive for centuries. In conditions of excessive damp, its deterioration is irreversible within decades. The wooden chests found in the sealed space at Roche Abbey in South Yorkshire, discovered when English heritage investigators opened the blocked doorway in the eastern claustral range between 1994 and 1997, had not survived in recoverable condition. The wood was decayed. The iron fittings that had attached hinges and lock plates and carrying handles to the exterior of the chests had corroded, the metal oxidized to a condition in which the original forms were legible, but the material was friable, and the object's shapes were understood rather than seen. The contents of the chests, whatever they had held, were represented, in the condition in which the investigators found them, by corroded metal objects that could not be fully identified due to the state of their preservation. The identifiable forms were gone into decay. The chests had held something. The something could not be named with the precision the record required, and so it was recorded as corroded metal objects of indeterminate type, and the excavation notes moved carefully forward from that detail without expanding it into a claim the physical evidence could not support. The oak door-frame timbers at Roche were by contrast recoverable. The dendrochronological analysis of these timbers, the cross-matching of their annual growth ring sequences against the master oak chronology, built up from thousands of sampled timbers across England and the continent, produced a felling date range of 1527 to 1536. The mathematics of dendrochronology are not approximate in the way that many archaeological dating methods are. A ring sequence cross-matched successfully against a master chronology produces a floating date that can be pinned to specific calendar years once the sapwood is accounted for and the match position is established. The Roche timbers cross-matched to a position that indicated felling in the decade between 1527 and 1536. The documentary record establishes that Roche Abbey was dissolved in 1538. The gap between the felling date of the doorframe timbers and the dissolution date is narrow, perhaps a year, perhaps a decade, and the implication of a doorframe installed in the final years of the monastery's existence, in a chamber that was subsequently sealed with mortared rubble incorporating dissolution period floor tile fragments, is a sequence of events that can be read with reasonable confidence. The space was reinforced, then it was sealed. The reinforcement preceded the sealing by some years. The sealing preceded the dissolution by some months, or possibly weeks. The rubble that sealed the doorway at Roche was not distinguishable in its construction technique from the original masonry of the surrounding passage walls. This is a detail worth sitting with. A blocking wall built to conceal a chamber would ideally not advertise itself as a blocking wall. It would be built to match the surrounding stonework in its coursing, its mortar color, its surface texture, its height. The Roche blocking wall achieved this sufficiently that the chamber behind it was not identified from surface examination of the passage walls, but from the geophysical survey conducted prior to the opening excavation, which revealed the hollow space beyond the apparently solid wall as a contrast in the radar return. To the eye, the wall was part of the passage. To the ground-penetrating radar, it was a thin screen in front of an empty space. The investigation reached the wall, assessed the wall, and then carefully opened the wall, and the air on the far side was different from the air in the passage, and the temperature was different, and the corroded remains of the wooden chests were on the floor in the darkness, and the door-frame timbers that produced the felling date of 1527 to 1536 were still in their arch, still holding the outline of the doorway that had been installed there in the last decade of the monastery's existence, and then sealed behind a wall, indistinguishable from its surroundings. A sealed vault chamber in the centuries before its opening exists in a temporal condition that is not quite like anything above ground. Above ground, time accumulates visibly. The stone weathers, the mortar erodes between the courses. The plant life that seeds itself into the crevices of exposed walls pries the joints apart over decades and centuries, the surfaces of dressed stone becoming pitted and rounded and eventually unreadable. Below ground, in a sealed chamber, this process is suspended. The stone of the vault walls maintains its dressed surface. The mortar in the joints maintains its original character, not softened by weather, not leached by rain, not eaten by the freeze-thaw cycling that does most of its visible work on exposed surfaces in northern climates. The cut face of a vault block in a sealed chamber is, when first examined by an investigator who has opened the space, essentially the same surface it was on the day it was dressed. The tool marks of the medieval mason who shaped it are still present in the stone. The lime mortar between the courses is still the lime mortar mixed and applied by the hands of the builders who erected the vault. Everything inside the chamber is in some sense still exactly where it was left. The time that has passed on the surface, the dissolution, the centuries of agricultural and industrial and post-industrial England passing overhead, has not reached the sealed interior of the vault. It is the same room it was. The air is different. The objects are aged in the ways that their materials permit aging in stable conditions. The room itself is unchanged. The sealed chamber at Netley Abbey, as recorded in the 2004 investigation notes, was a rectangular space approximately 3 meters by 4. The walls were intact, the ceiling curved in its barrel vault, the ribs of dressed stone visible in torchlight against the surrounding rubble-built spandrels between them, the whole assembly holding the load of the earth above with the compression geometry that medieval builders understood through practice and applied with consistent results across several centuries of underground construction. The floor was undisturbed. The air was, by measurement, distinct from the air in the access tunnel that had been cut to reach the threshold. Elevated carbon dioxide, depressed oxygen, the chemistry of a space that had been sealed and had remained sealed. The temperature was 4 degrees lower than the temperature of the access tunnel. These measurements were taken at the threshold, at the moment of first crossing into the space, before the investigators moved further in and began to disturb the atmospheric conditions that had established themselves over the period of sealing. The period of sealing was not specified in the investigation notes, with a precision that would allow a confident date. The documentary record for the Netley site, a Premonstratensian house dissolved in 1536, establishes the final years of the monastery's active existence, and the architectural evidence of the vault passage is consistent with the construction period of the eastern claustral range, dating broadly to the 13th century. A chamber built in the 13th century and sealed at or near the dissolution in 1536 would have been sealed for approximately 468 years at the time of the 2004 investigation. 468 years is a figure that passes through the mind at this hour without demanding to be fully processed. It is simply a long time, a sufficient time. Time enough for the air inside to become measurably distinct from all other air. Time enough for the temperature to stabilize at its 4-degree separation from whatever lay on the other side of the threshold. Time enough for the stone and the mortar and the sealed atmosphere to settle into a condition so stable that the investigation team's entry was the first significant perturbation that space had experienced since the last stone was set. Before the investigators entered, before the threshold was crossed, before the temperature drop was measured, before the site notes recorded the atmospheric readings and the dimensions of the rectangular room and the condition of the walls and ceiling and floor, the chamber existed as it had existed for however many years it had been sealed, holding its form in the dark beneath the ruins of the Abbey precinct above it. The barrel vault curved overhead in the darkness, the dressed stone of the ribs maintaining the precise geometry of their construction against the load of 8 centuries of earth. The walls stood in the stable cool, their lime mortar still binding the stone courses with the force of material that had had a very long time to set. The floor lay undisturbed, the surface of it unchanged from the last occasion on which a foot had crossed it, and a hand had set a key to a lock and drawn the bolt and swung the heavy oak door closed behind a departing figure. The air turned on itself in the sealed space, the slow chemistry of a room breathing its own atmosphere, accumulating the measurable signature of a prolonged enclosure. Nothing moved. There was no light, and there was no sound that penetrated from above, and there was no variation in the temperature to mark the difference between one season and the next. The walls held, the ceiling held, the floor held what had been placed on it, and then remained, holding it still, in the dark, in the cool, in the air that had not been exchanged with any other air for as long as the vault had been sealed. Nothing inside it had moved. Catherine Briggs kept her Dictionary of British Folk Tales in 2 volumes, each one dense and unhurried, the type small, and the entries compressed into paragraphs that carry enormous distances in very few words. The binding is cloth. The pages have the particular weight of reference books printed in the early 1970s, when academic publishing still assumed the reader would sit with the book rather than scan it. Somewhere in the middle of the first volume, in the section organized by tale type and geographical origin, there is an entry that runs to fewer than 200 words. It describes a sealed underground chamber. It names a robed figure who appears at the threshold. It records a warning, given and heeded. The source notation at the end of the paragraph reads, "Collected from oral tradition, Somerset, date unrecorded." The tale itself has no title that the community gave it. The collector who set it down gave it a classification number instead, and that number placed it among at least 13 other tales of the same essential kind, gathered from communities across England, from Yorkshire to Gloucestershire, from Lincolnshire to Cheshire, none of them apparently in contact with one another, all of them carrying the same central image, a space beneath the ground, a door that has been sealed, and the persistent knowledge that something lies on the other side of it. 14 tales in total, Briggs recorded, 14 distinct regional legends attached to 14 dissolved English abbey sites, each describing a sealed underground space and a figure in monastic dress who stands between the seeker and whatever the space contains. The folklorist Jeremy Hart, writing considerably later, suggested that this consistency across geographically separated communities is not easily explained by the usual mechanics of legend diffusion. The 14 communities share no obvious point of cultural contact, no single collector who might have carried the shape of the story from one place to another, no regional fair or market where it could have circulated. Hart's suggestion is measured and careful, as folklore scholarship tends to be. What he proposed is simply that a pattern this consistent, repeated across communities this distant from one another, may represent something that each community held independently rather than borrowed from its neighbors. The memory of something hidden, preserved in story, because the story was the only container left once the documents were gone and the buildings were down. The entry in Briggs's dictionary sits on the page with enormous calm. It does not announce itself as significant. It is surrounded on all sides by other entries of similar length, similar compression, similar quiet precision. A reader moving through the volume at the pace Briggs intended would pass through it in perhaps a minute, but the tale it contains has been moving through the communities of Somerset for a very long time, longer than the book that holds it, longer than the collector who wrote it down, longer in some form than any individual who has carried it. The tale survived the dissolution of the monastery it attaches to. It survived the demolition of the abbey's walls and the conversion of its stone into farm buildings and field boundaries. It survived the enclosure of the land and the cycles of agriculture that followed. It arrived in the 20th century in the memory of people who may not have known precisely what it was they were remembering, only that a passage existed, that it was sealed, and that the sealing was deliberate and old. At Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire, the western range of the monastic complex stands along the bank of the River Skell in a state of preservation that is remarkable for a building that has not had a roof for 4.5 centuries. The Solarium, the great vaulted storehouse that runs the full length of the western range, extends for over 90 meters, its ceiling supported by a double row of columns, the stone floor intact beneath the open sky. On a gray afternoon, when the light is flat and the air carries the smell of the river, the space has a quality of suspension, as though it has been waiting a very long time in a condition of patient stillness. The floor underfoot is even and dressed and cold. Visitors pass through it, and their footsteps carry differently in different sections, a variation in the resonance of the stone, a slight change in the quality of the sound that is easy to notice and equally easy to forget. It is in the area around that variation in resonance that antiquarian notes from the late 18th century record a persistent local tradition. The notes were compiled by a writer whose interest in the Abbey's history was thorough enough to seek out the accounts of people who lived and worked in the Skell Valley, farming families, laborers, people who had spent their lives on the land above and around the Abbey precinct. What they told him, in various formulations that he rendered into a single compact summary, was that a passage beneath the solarium led deeper than the visible undercroft, that the last abbot of the house had sealed it before the surrender, and that it had not been opened since. The abbot they named was Marmaduke Bradley, who surrendered fountains to the crown in 1539. The passage in their account ran east and then turned, and what lay at its end was not described with any specificity, only that it was sealed, and that Bradley had sealed it, and that the sealing was known. The antiquarian noted the tradition without endorsing it, and he set it down alongside other material he had gathered, in the same register of careful uncertainty, and moved on. The notes eventually made their way into a collection and were preserved, and the tradition they contain was preserved with them, a piece of knowledge that had already been traveling through the Skell Valley for at least 2.5 centuries before the antiquarian found it and wrote it down. Farming families in the valley carried a version of this knowledge well into the 20th century. The Fountains Abbey Oral History Project, conducted through a partnership between the National Trust and the University of Leeds in the 1990s, gathered accounts from those families, interviews with people whose grandparents and great-grandparents had worked the land adjacent to the Abbey precinct, who had in turn inherited their knowledge from generations before them. What the project collected, among many other things, was a recurring reference to what the families called a lower cellar beneath the visible cellarium floor. The phrase appeared across multiple interviews. It appeared in the accounts of families that had no evident connection to one another, no shared ancestry, no obvious route by which the same specific detail might have passed between them. 3 generations of family memory, the project's researchers noted, all pointing toward the same general area of the Abbey's underground plan, a space below the space that visitors walk through, referred to with a matter-of-fact familiarity that suggested it had never been considered remarkable, only known. The oral tradition at Fountains is specific in a way that many traditions are not. It does not describe treasure in the language of legend. No gold, no jewels, no accumulated wealth beyond the usual human reach. It describes, simply, a lower space, a sealed one, known to the families who had worked that land across many generations and not formally examined by anyone outside the valley. That specificity is one of the qualities that folklore scholars consider when assessing the relationship between oral tradition and historical reality. A tradition that attaches precise architectural detail to a precise location and maintains that detail across multiple generations without significant variation is of a different kind than a tradition that floats loosely around a landscape without fixing to any particular point. The Fountains tradition fixes to a point. It is always fixed to the same point. At Gervault's Abbey in North Yorkshire, the ruins stand in private grounds and are accessible to visitors who cross a field from the road, the stones rising from the grass in the disorderly way of a building that was demolished without plan rather than carefully dismantled. The walls survive to varying heights, some chest high, some reduced almost to foundation level, the ground between them uneven with the buried remnants of floors and passageways that the demolition left in place rather than clearing. In 1903, the Yorkshire Archaeological Journal published a short account submitted by a local correspondent. The account described what had happened to a farm worker plowing the fields adjacent to the Abbey precinct some years before the submission. The correspondent did not provide a precise date for the incident, only that it had occurred within living memory. The farm worker, the account states, was working with a plow when the ground gave way beneath him. The collapse was not catastrophic. A section of subsoil had dropped rather than the earth opening dramatically, but it was sufficient to reveal, when he looked into the depression, the upper courses of a stone staircase descending into darkness. He had a lantern. He descended several steps. The account is careful about what he claimed to have seen, a vaulted ceiling beginning to take shape above him as he descended, the space widening as the staircase went down, the extent of the chamber beyond the reach of his lantern's light. He went down far enough to see the vault beginning. He did not go further. When he returned to the surface, he reported what he had found to the landowner, whose response, according to the account, was to instruct that the depression be filled in and the matter not raised with investigators or local antiquarians. The Yorkshire Archaeological Journal correspondent who submitted the account added a brief note at the end. He had spoken to the farm worker himself, who was by then elderly, and found his account consistent and without obvious embellishment. The correspondent could not verify the location precisely, as the filled depression was indistinguishable from the surrounding field. The landowner in question had since died. The account entered the journal's record and remained there, a piece of testimony, submitted carefully, received with the journal's usual scholarly caution, and not followed up in any subsequent issue. What the Gervais account offers is not evidence of anything specific. It is rather a particularly clear example of how oral testimony carries through rural communities in the period before archaeological investigation became standard practice. A farm worker sees something, tells his employer, is instructed to silence, and the knowledge passes into a private channel rather than a public one. The account reached the journal 30-odd years after the event, filtered through memory and retelling, and it cannot be verified by any physical means available now. But it is there. It is in the record. A man descended a staircase in a field adjacent to Gervais Abbey and saw a vaulted ceiling beginning to curve above him in the lantern light, and then he filled in the hole and said nothing for decades. And then he said something, and someone wrote it down. The communities around Furness Abbey in Cumbria hold a tradition that is, in certain respects, the most materially specific of any attached to a dissolved English abbey site. Furness stands at the head of a narrow valley opening toward the Dudon estuary. The remaining walls of the abbey church rising from the floor of the valley in warm red sandstone, the surrounding hills rising steeply on three sides, the tradition preserved by communities in the surrounding area, and recorded by the Barrow and Furness Local History Society in accounts gathered across several decades of the 20th century, describes a network of passages running beneath the Abbey precinct and extending outward toward the estuary shoreline, passages used, in the tradition's account, to move valuables from the Abbey to points along the coast where they could be transferred by water rather than overland. The tradition is specific about the direction of the passages, the approximate locations of the exits toward the estuary, and the purpose of the network. It is also specific about the period. The community's understanding has always placed the use of the passages in the final years before the dissolution, In the months when the surrender of the house became increasingly inevitable, and the movement of objects out of the precinct became increasingly urgent, the passages are described not as ancient infrastructure, but as deliberately constructed roads built for the specific purpose of covert transfer and used within a narrow window of time. What gives the furnace tradition a quality distinct from most oral legends of this kind is an object, somewhere in the village of Dalton in Furness, in the possession of a family whose connection to the Abbey lands runs back several generations. There is reported to be a sketch map. The map, as described by those who have seen it or heard it described, is drawn on aged paper, the lines faint, the ink faded to a tone that sits somewhere between brown and gray. It shows the outline of the Abbey precinct wall. It shows several dotted lines extending from points within the precinct toward the shoreline. The dotted lines are the passages. Someone drew this map, someone who claimed, or whose ancestor claimed, to have direct knowledge of where the passage entrances were located, not inferred from landscape observation, not extrapolated from the tradition's general narrative, but known from a source the map's maker considered reliable enough to commit to paper. The map has not been submitted to any archive. It has not been formally examined by any archaeologist or historian. The family in whose possession it reportedly sits has not, as far as the Barrow and Furness Local History Society's records indicate, made any move to bring it into the formal record. It exists in the same private channel as the Jervalks farm workers' account, knowledge that is passed through families rather than institutions, maintained by the same quiet transmission that carries seed knowledge and field knowledge and the memory of what lies beneath the land across generations of people who work the same ground. The distinction between what travels through families and what travels through archives is not simply a matter of verification, it is also a matter of what gets asked. Archives preserve answers to questions that someone with institutional authority considered worth asking. Family memory preserves answers to questions that were worth knowing in order to continue living on the land, working it, understanding it, questions whose answers had a practical or emotional or social value that did not require official recognition to persist. The families of the Skell Valley did not keep their knowledge of the lower cellar because a scholar asked them to. They kept it because it was theirs, attached to a place they worked, a piece of the landscape's interior life that had been passed down alongside everything else worth passing down. Catherine Briggs understood this distinction. Her dictionary is organized as a scholarly reference, but the impulse behind it is something simpler and more patient. The recognition that certain kinds of knowledge exist in forms that will not survive long enough to be properly examined unless someone notices them and writes them down before the people who carry them are gone. The 14 legends she recorded existed, each of them in the memory of communities that had been carrying them for several generations already by the time she collected them. Some of them she gathered herself. Some came to her through other collectors, whose notes she incorporated. In each case, the act of writing them down was a rescue, not a validation, not an endorsement, only a preservation. The Somerset legend she recorded, the one with the sealed chamber and the robed figure and the warning, was already old when it reached her. The community that held it did not know precisely how old. Such things are rarely dated from the inside. They are simply known, and then they continue to be known, and the generation that holds them at any given moment is aware that the generation before them held the same thing, and that is generally considered sufficient continuity. The robed figure at the threshold is not given a name in Briggs's entry. The warning is not quoted directly, The chamber's contents are not described. What is preserved is the essential architecture of the memory. There is a space. It is sealed. Someone stands between the living and whatever the space contains, and that someone has the authority of the institution that built the space in the first place. Jeremy Hart's observation about the consistency of this pattern across 14 communities deserves a moment of simple attention. Folklore transmission usually leaves traces of its routes: a figure who traveled between two communities, a fair where stories were exchanged, a broadsheet printed and distributed, a traveling performer who carried tales from one region to another. When those routes exist, folklorists can usually identify them, at least in outline. The pattern of the 14 sealed Abbey legends leaves no such obvious routes. The communities that hold them are separated by the distances of a large and regionally varied country, divided by dialect and local custom and the particular loyalties of place. And yet the core image is the same: ground, stone, sealed, known. Hart's suggestion that this represents collective cultural memory rather than diffusion is careful and provisional, as scholarly suggestions should be. It is also the most parsimonious available explanation for a consistency that would otherwise require 14 independent inventions of the same essential tale. The great solarium at Fountains on that gray afternoon stretches ahead for a distance that feels longer than its measurements. The columns repeat. The ceiling repeats. The stone floor, cold and even, extends beneath feet that make a particular sound in the area where the resonance changes, a sound slightly different from the sound made by the same footstep in every other part of the building. It is easy to walk over this spot without noticing it. It is easy to notice it and forget it. The farming families who have worked the land above it for generations noticed it and did not forget, because what they were noticing confirmed something they already knew: that the floor above has a floor below, and that the floor below is where certain things were placed and sealed, and that the sealing was Bradley's work, and that the knowledge of it is older than anyone alive. The Norton Priory community in Cheshire did not keep a legend of the same kind, so far as the collected record shows. What they kept was the land itself, farmed and worked for generations after the priory's dissolution, the ground cover changing over centuries while the subsoil remained as it had been left. Communities do not always tell stories about what lies beneath the fields they work. Sometimes they simply work the fields, and the knowledge is spatial and practical rather than narrative, not a story to be told, but a sense of the ground's interior that is carried in the body rather than in language. The farm worker at Jervolix who caused the ground to give way was not apparently expecting what he found. The ground surprised him, but the farm worker who filled the hole did not apparently find what he had been told in any contradiction with what he had seen, only in his employer's interest that the knowledge remain private rather than public. Private knowledge of this kind is not rare. It is, if anything, the condition of most knowledge that attaches to dissolved monastic landscapes across England. The formal record, the commissioner's inventories, the Court of Augmentations accounts, the episcopal valuations, captured what was visible and accessible in the period of the dissolution itself, what lay beneath, what had been moved before the commissioners arrived, what had been sealed rather than surrendered. These things were not captured by any formal instrument because they were not presented to any formal instrument. They passed instead into the channels that carry things which cannot safely be recorded: family memory, local tradition, the quiet transmission of knowledge between people who share a place and a history and an interest in the continued custody of what they know. The Barrow and Furness Local History Society's records make clear that the tradition around Furness Abbey is genuinely old in the community's sense. That is, no living person within the tradition can identify a point at which it began, only that it predates the memory of the oldest person they interviewed. This is the texture of oral tradition at its most stable, not a story with an identifiable origin, but a condition of knowing that has simply always been present in the community's understanding of the landscape it inhabits. The passage network beneath the precinct is not something the community debates or speculates about. It is something they carry as settled in the way that knowledge of field boundaries and drainage patterns is settled, not requiring argument, not requiring external confirmation, simply known. The sketch map in Dalton and Furness, faint on its aged paper, with its dotted lines moving from the precinct toward the estuary, represents something slightly different from oral tradition alone. It represents the decision of an individual at some point in the past to give the community's knowledge a fixed material form, to draw what was known so that it could be held, rather than simply spoken. The person who made that decision was not trying to submit the map to any institution. There is no evidence they had any interest in formal validation. They were apparently simply recording what they knew or what they had been told in a form that could be kept and shown and passed from hand to hand rather than carried only in memory. The map is not a scholarly document. It is not an archaeological artifact in any formal sense. It is a piece of private knowledge given a material body, folded and preserved in a family's possession, not yet part of any official account of Furness Abbey or its underground history. Briggs wrote that folk tradition is the memory of the community about itself. The phrase is simple and accurate and carries a great deal of weight for anyone who has spent time with the material she collected. Communities remember themselves through what they have kept, through the tales they have told their children, the knowledge they have handed along the chain of generations, the particular details of landscape and history that they have considered worth preserving beyond the lifetime of any individual. The 14 sealed Abbey legends are, in Briggs's sense, memories of communities about themselves and about the landscape they inhabit. They remember a time before the dissolution when the abbeys were active institutions with active underground lives. They remember something that was sealed. They remember, dimly and through many layers of retelling, that the sealing was intentional and that it happened quickly and that it left something on the other side that has not been seen since. The robed figure who appears at the threshold of the sealed chamber in the Somerset tale collected by Briggs is not described in detail. The warning he offers is not quoted. His authority is monastic. That much is consistent across the variants of the tale that Briggs gathered, and his presence at the threshold is protective rather than threatening. He does not forbid entry out of malice. He forbids it in the way that a door forbids it, or a sealed wall, or the cold air of a space that has been closed for a very long time and has no language for what it means to be opened. He is the tradition's way of giving a face to what is otherwise purely architectural. The fact of a door that does not open, a space that does not yield, a knowledge that has been maintained across generations without ever being fully resolved into information of the kind that institutions can process and file. The cellarium at Fountains is open to the sky at this hour of the afternoon, the light settling in the long pale wash of a day, going slowly toward evening. The stone columns stand in their double row. The floor runs ahead, cold and even, the sound of footsteps changing in a particular section and then changing back. The valley outside carries the sound of the river in the distance. The farming families who have worked this valley across many generations are not, Most of them, the same families whose grandparents spoke to the Oral History Project's researchers in the 1990s. People move, families end, land passes to new hands. Knowledge does not always survive the transition, but some of it does. Some of it is in the archive now, recorded in the project's collected interviews, given the institutional form it did not previously have, preserved in the way that Briggs preserved the Somerset tale. Not confirmed, not explained, only noted and held. The sketch map in Dalton and Furness has the quality of things that have outlasted the certainty that produced them. The person who drew it knew, or believed they knew, where the passages were. That certainty has not been transferred to the map's current custodians in the same form. What they hold is the map itself, and the family tradition that the map represents direct knowledge rather than inference or legend, and the continued decision maintained across however many generations have held it, not to submit it to any formal process of examination. The dotted lines on the aged paper mark routes through the Abbey precinct, through the ground beneath it, toward the estuary where boats could wait. The lines are faint. The paper is folded at the same creases it has always been folded at. The ink that made those lines dried a very long time ago, in the hand of someone who wanted the knowledge to have a fixed form, who understood that memory alone might not be sufficient, who drew the passages as they understood them and then closed the paper and put it somewhere it would keep. Some kinds of knowledge travel through families rather than archives. They move in the channel of private transmission, from hand to hand rather than institution to institution, maintained by the recognition that certain things are worth keeping, whether or not the keeping is officially sanctioned. The sketch map is such a thing. The fountain's lower cellar is such a thing. The vaulted space the Jervalk's farm worker descended into for a few steps before turning back is such a thing, known to him, reported once, filled in, and then carried in memory until it reached the journal's record decades later. The sealed chamber in the Somerset tale is such a thing, a piece of knowledge so persistent that it survived the dissolution, the demolition, the centuries of agricultural change, the loss of the institution that originally produced the knowledge, and arrived in Briggs's dictionary in the compressed and careful form of a folk tale, with a source notation that says only, collected from oral tradition, Somerset, date unrecorded. The date unrecorded is the honest part. No one knows when the knowledge began. No one knows what form it took in its first generation of transmission, whether it was explicit and detailed, or already compressed and symbolic, or somewhere between those poles. What is known is that it arrived in the 20th century, recognizably intact, its core image consistent with the 13 other tales Briggs recorded across England, its geography still attached to a specific place, its central fact still the same. Something was sealed, someone sealed it, and the sealing has held. The Somerset tale closes in Briggs's entry without resolution. The seeker turns back at the threshold. The robed figure remains. The chamber stays sealed. The entry ends, and the classification number follows, and the next entry begins. The dictionary does not comment on what this means or what it suggests. It records what was collected and moves on in the manner of a reference that trusts its readers to sit with what they have been given. The knowledge is there, the tradition is there. The community that carried it across however many generations is somewhere, continuing to carry it or not, its members living their lives in a landscape that contains, somewhere beneath it, a sealed space that the tradition has always insisted is real. The folded map in Dalton and Furness rests in its place, unexamined. The dotted lines of the passages faint on the aged paper, the precinct wall drawn in a hand that has been still for a very long time. The knowledge it carries has not yet been formally written down in any language that institutions recognize as primary evidence. It belongs to the family that holds it, to the community that surrounds that family, to the tradition that produced both the map and the understanding of what the map represents. It is there, it is kept, and the roots it records, if they exist as the tradition insists they do, run quiet and unverified through the ground beneath the Dudden Valley, sealed at both ends, patient in the way that things sealed in stone have always been patient, waiting in no particular distress for whatever comes next or does not come at all. The ground-penetrating radar printout from the 2019 Glastonbury survey is approximately the width of a broadsheet page, printed on paper that has the particular slightly waxy quality of technical documents produced for archival deposit. Along its horizontal axis run bands of color, warm oranges and yellows near the top, shading downward through greens and cooler blues as the depth increases, each band representing a stratum of earth interpreted from the instrument's reflected signal. The survey team from the University of Reading worked the southeastern precinct of the Abbey grounds in a systematic grid. The equipment moved in slow parallel passes across grass that has grown over the Abbey's footprint for nearly 5 centuries. At approximately 5 meters below the surface, in a location that corresponds to no feature recorded on the Abbey's known ground plan, the color gradients shift. A clean rectangular outline appears, sharper than the surrounding strata, its edges more defined than any natural formation would produce, sitting in the data the way a held breath sits in a quiet room. The coordinates are printed in the margin of the report. The dimensions of the anomaly are noted. The survey team's conclusion, published in the report that followed, was that the feature warranted targeted excavation, that its dimensions and depth placed it beyond the range of later post-dissolution disturbance, and that its position relative to the surviving ground plan of Glastonbury's southeastern precinct was not consistent with any structure previously identified at the site. The recommendation for excavation was formally recorded. As of the survey's publication, the excavation had not been carried out. Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset was at the time of its dissolution in 1539 the wealthiest monastic house in England. Its annual income exceeded £3,000 at a period when a skilled craftsman might earn £10 in a year. The survey, conducted 8 decades after that survey's publication, the 2019 work, represents one of the more comprehensive geophysical investigations of any dissolved English abbey site, combining ground-penetrating radar with earth resistance profiling and magnetometry. 3 separate instruments reading the same ground from 3 separate angles. The rectangular anomaly at 5 meters appeared consistently across the combined dataset. The surrounding soil profile did not. Whatever the feature is, it is real, in the sense that instruments designed to find things record it clearly and consistently, and it is unidentified, in the sense that nothing in the existing documentary or archaeological record accounts for it. The report sits in the archive. The coordinates are on record. The ground above the anomaly is grass. A different kind of evidence emerged at Roche Abbey in South Yorkshire, where English Heritage conducted excavations between 1994 and 1997 in the eastern claustral range. Roche was a cistern house dissolved in 1538, and its dissolution was described by a contemporary witness as having been carried out with particular speed and thoroughness, the leads stripped from the roofs, the glass from the windows, the timber from the floors, all within a matter of days of the commissioner's departure. What the stripping did not reach was below ground. During the 1994 to 1997 excavation campaign, investigators working in the subfloor level of the Eastern Range encountered a blocked doorway set into the claustral wall, the arch of the original opening still intact. The space within it filled with mortared rubble, laid in courses, neat enough to suggest the work had been done by someone with genuine masonry skill and adequate time. The surrounding stonework showed no sign of disturbance. The blocking was flush with the wall face. Probes taken before the wall was opened indicated a vaulted space on the other side. The wall was carefully opened. The chamber beyond was small. The report does not give exact dimensions, but describes it as a confined vaulted space, and within it, investigators found the remains of wooden chests reduced to their iron fittings, and a quantity of corroded metal objects that the excavation report describes as impossible to identify with confidence due to the degree of deterioration, and for the organic material, the wood of the chests, whatever fabric or organic packing may have surrounded the metal objects, had decayed entirely. The iron remained. The report notes the objects present, records that they could not be identified, and moves on to the next feature in the excavation sequence. Dendrochronological analysis of oak timbers from the door frame of the sealed passage produced a result that places the felling of the trees used in its construction in the range 1527 to 1536. The dissolution of Roche Abbey was completed in 1538. The door frame had been installed and the passage reinforced in the final decade of the monastery's existence. The sequence the physical evidence suggests is this. At some point between 1527 and the dissolution, the space behind the eastern claustral wall was modified, the door frame installed or replaced with heavier timber, the chamber prepared in some way for a specific purpose, and then, at some point before or at the time of dissolution, the doorway was blocked with mortared rubble, the face of the wall dressed to match the surrounding stonework, and the chamber left sealed. What was in the chests before their wood decayed is not known. The iron fittings that held them together survive. The objects inside them did not survive in identifiable form. The dendrochronology report is precise in what it establishes and what it does not. It establishes when the timber was cut. It does not establish why the chamber was sealed, or by whom, or whether the objects now present as corroded unidentifiable metal are what was originally stored there, or the residue of objects removed before sealing. A room can be sealed for many reasons. The record establishes the sealing. The reason belongs to the silence on the other side of the mortared wall. Medieval Archaeology published a report in 2011 from a team working at a Benedictine site in the East Midlands. The site name is withheld in the publication, pending full excavation of the feature the report describes. What the report gives is the following: investigators working beneath a chapter house floor, specifically in a sub-chapter house space that had not appeared on any previous survey of the site, found a small vaulted room with its door blocked from the outside, the walls of the room intact, the floor undisturbed, and on the floor a collection of fragmented liturgical objects. Roberta Gilchrist and her colleagues describe the arrangement of the fragments in terms that suggest deliberate rather than casual placement, the pieces distributed across the floor in a pattern that the authors interpret as consistent with ritual concealment practices documented at continental European monastic sites. Objects deliberately broken, fragments deliberately placed, the blocking of the door accomplished from outside the room, meaning that whoever broke and placed the objects left before the door was sealed. The report in Medieval Archaeology describes the find, gives the interpretive framework, documents the parallel cases from continental European archaeology and notes that the full excavation of the site is ongoing. The site name remains withheld. The vaulted room, as described in the report, had its walls intact and its floor undisturbed at the time of discovery, which means the arrangement of the fragments on the floor was exactly as it had been left. At whatever moment the door was blocked and the earth above settled into the stillness, it maintained until the investigators' tools broke through it. What the objects were before they were broken, and what their original function was within the community that used them, the report does not establish with certainty. What it does establish is that someone broke them deliberately, arranged the pieces deliberately, and sealed the room behind them, and that this pattern of behavior corresponds to documented practices at other sites in other countries, suggesting it belongs to a tradition rather than an isolated individual act, a tradition of concealment, a practice with a grammar to it, comprehensible to the people who performed it, now reconstructed at several removes by people working in a different century with different tools and different questions. The room at the unnamed East Midlands site had been sealed long enough that its air, its floor, and the arrangement of its contents had remained undisturbed from the moment of sealing to the moment the investigators broke through. Time had passed above it. The chapter house floor had been walked over for whatever period the monastery continued to function after the sealing. Then the dissolution came, and the floor above was exposed to weather, and the site passed through whatever sequence of agricultural and residential uses characterizes the history of dissolved monastic land in England. And through all of it, the subchapter house space maintained its sealed condition and held the arrangement on its floor exactly as it had been left. The report is filed in the archive. The site is known to the relevant authorities and to the authors of the report. The excavation permissions work through the appropriate channels. English Heritage Research reports on undercroft conditions at Whitby Abbey, Roche Abbey, and Fountains Abbey. Each documents subsurface anomalies identified by geophysical survey. The report on Whitby, numbered 8/2001, describes anomalies in the northern range that the surveying team was unable to account for within the known ground plan. The Roche Abbey report, numbered 14/2003, and drawing on data from the mid-decade excavation campaign, documents the blocked chamber and its contents, and notes that further geophysical work in the southern range returned results that had not yet been investigated at the time of the report's preparation. The Fountains Abbey report, numbered 22/2007, documents anomalies below the solarium floor in an area corresponding to no known structural feature, a reading taken independently of the oral history project that gathered family accounts of the same area, and arriving at a similar conclusion through an entirely different method. Each of these three reports contains a column, or its equivalent, recording the status of the anomaly and the recommended next action. At the time of each report's publication, the recommended excavation had not been authorized. The language used is technical and precise. The anomaly is described in terms of its dimensions and depth. The recommendation is stated. The status is noted. The report is published, deposited, and available to anyone who requests it through the relevant archive. The patience required by this process is the patience of institutional archaeology, methodical, bounded by permissions and funding cycles and competing priorities, moving at a pace determined not by the urgency of what may be beneath the ground, but by the administrative and scholarly frameworks that govern responsible excavation. A sealed space identified, formally recorded, and left undisturbed is not a failure of the process. It is the process working as it is designed to work. The instruments have reached the threshold. The decision about whether to cross it belongs to a set of considerations that extend well beyond any individual researcher's curiosity. The anomaly at Glastonbury's southeastern precinct, identified in 2019, sits at 5 meters depth in ground that has not been formally disturbed since the dissolution. The feature is known, its coordinates are on record. The grass grows above it as it grew the year before the survey and will grow the year after. There is a particular quality to the silence that accumulates around these documented uncertainties, not the silence of suppression or institutional reluctance, but the ordinary silence of careful scholarship, moving at its own pace, bound by the reasonable constraints that prevent irreversible decisions from being made hastily. An excavation is not reversible. Once a sealed chamber is opened, it has been opened. Whatever state it was in before, the air unchanged, the arrangement on the floor undisturbed, the organic materials preserved by stable cool conditions, that state cannot be recovered. The decision to open must therefore be made within a framework that considers not only what might be found, but what might be destroyed in the finding. And that framework takes time, and the time it takes is time during which the sealed space continues to exist in its sealed condition, exactly as it has existed for however many centuries preceded the survey that located it. This is, in the long view, a small amount of additional time for a space that has already waited several centuries. The investigation at a previously sealed undercroft passage at Netley Abbey in Hampshire in 2004 recorded specific atmospheric data at the moment of threshold crossing, a temperature drop of approximately 4 degrees Celsius, elevated carbon dioxide, reduced oxygen concentration. These measurements were taken and recorded in the field report and subsequently referenced in publications drawing on the Netley investigation. They represent the physical signature of an enclosed space that has exchanged air with the world outside it, very slowly, if at all, over a prolonged period. The air inside the chamber had been breathing itself, cycling through whatever slow chemical interactions occur in sealed limestone spaces over time, accumulating the particular atmospheric quality that the instruments detected at the threshold. The chamber at Netley, as described in the 2004 report, measured approximately 3 meters by 4. The walls were intact. The floor was undisturbed. No objects were described in the threshold investigation. The record of the 2004 work describes the atmospheric findings and the structural condition of the space rather than its contents, leaving the question of contents to any subsequent excavation. The report exists. The investigation happened. The chamber was found to be exactly what the subsurface surveys had suggested it would be, a real enclosed space, structurally intact, atmospheric conditions confirming long-term sealed status. What is notable about the sequence of investigations at sites including Netley, Roche, Glastonbury, Fountains, Whitby, and the unnamed East Midlands Benedictine House is that the pattern each investigation contributes to is not a pattern of nothing. Sealed spaces are real. They are structurally intact in documented cases. The atmospheric conditions within them are consistent with centuries of sealed status. The objects found within opened examples are real objects, corroded, deteriorated, in some cases unidentifiable, but physically present and in positions consistent with deliberate storage or deliberate arrangement rather than casual loss. The anomalies identified by geophysical survey at sites where excavation has not yet been authorized are consistent in character and dimension with the sealed spaces already confirmed at sites where excavation has proceeded. The pattern is not proof of what any specific sealed space contains. It is evidence that sealed spaces exist. that their existence is a real archaeological phenomenon at English-dissolved monastic sites, and that the combination of deliberate structural modification, targeted concealment of valuables documented in the commissioner's correspondence, and the geophysical anomalies recorded at multiple sites is consistent across the body of evidence in a way that places the question of what lies beneath these abbeys firmly within the domain of documented historical inquiry rather than legend or speculation. The inquiry is ongoing. It moves at the pace of institutional archaeology. Some of the spaces it concerns have been sealed since the 1530s. At Fountains Abbey, the area below the solarium floor that returned anomalous results in the 2001 geophysical survey is covered by one of the finest surviving examples of a Cistercian monastic building in England, the Great Solarium of the Western Range, its vaulted nave stretching for approximately 100 meters, the stone floor worn smooth by 8 centuries of foot traffic, the ceiling curving in a series of ribs that carry the weight of the range above with a structural logic as sound now as when it was built. Visitors walk through it on days when the site is open. The sound of footsteps on stone carries differently in different parts of the floor, a variation in resonance that the oral history accounts gathered in the 1990s describe across 3 generations of farming family memory. The lower cellar referred to in those accounts, located in the area where the 2001 survey found its anomaly. The 2 bodies of evidence, the family memory gathered by the Fountains Abbey Oral History Project in partnership with the University of Leeds, and the geophysical survey data obtained independently in 2001, were not coordinated. The families gave their accounts without knowledge of the survey findings. The survey was conducted without reference to the oral history. They arrived at the same location from different directions. Neither constitutes proof of what lies beneath the solarium floor. Together they constitute a convergence that the research record takes note of, and that the recommended excavation, pending authorization as of the relevant report's publication, would be positioned to resolve. The English Heritage Research Report 22/2007 describes the fountain's anomaly in the language appropriate to its register, measured, technical, careful about what the data establishes and what it does not. The status column records the authorization as pending. The document is filed. A dendrochronology report, a geophysical survey printout, a blocked doorway opening onto a vaulted space containing iron fittings and corroded metal, a subchapter house room with fragmented liturgical objects on the floor, in a deliberate arrangement. These are the kinds of things that the modern investigative record has produced at English Abbey sites, where careful attention has been applied and excavation has been possible. They are specific, they are documented, they exist in peer-reviewed journals and institutional research reports filed in accessible archives. The facts they record are verifiable, and the interpretations offered are held to the standards of scholarly evidence rather than the looser standards of legend or belief. What they do not yet answer at Glastonbury's southeastern precinct, beneath the solarium floor at Fountains, in the unexcavated ranges at Whitby, in the unnamed East Midlands Benedictine site, where the excavation continues, is the question of what is actually there. The instruments have found the shape of the answer. The contents of the shape remain on the other side of the next sealed wall, in the dark, in the cool and undisturbed air that has been holding the same steady temperature since the last person who knew what lay there sealed the passage and walked away. The sealed subchapter house space at the unnamed East Midlands Benedictine site exists as of the 2011 report in Medieval Archaeology, in a state of formal identification and documented incompletion. It has been found, Its existence has been described in a peer-reviewed publication. The site name has been withheld, which is a standard practice when full excavation is ongoing and premature disclosure of a site's location could result in unauthorized disturbance. The room itself, the small vaulted space, the blocked door, the fragmented liturgical objects on the floor in their deliberate arrangement, has been seen by the investigators who broke through into it, described in the language of archaeological reportage, and then left exactly as it was found. The floor of that room has not moved since the moment the objects were placed on it. The arrangement that the report describes, the pattern of fragments distributed across the undisturbed surface, is the last act of whoever performed the concealment, preserved in the stable cool of a sealed limestone space for however many centuries elapsed between the blocking of the door and the investigators' arrival. The ceiling curves overhead in the dark. The walls hold their plumb. The air has been exchanging its molecules with the surrounding limestone very slowly for a very long time, developing the particular atmospheric character that the instruments can detect at the threshold but cannot explain beyond the threshold's physical reach. The investigation continues. The permissions are working through the appropriate channels. The room holds its arrangement in the dark beneath a field, and the field holds the ordinary traffic of an English rural landscape above it, the light moving across it through the days, the seasons turning above the sealed spaces, unvarying interior temperature, the years accumulating in the way that years accumulate above things that have been sealed and left. The questions that the modern investigative record has produced are not smaller than the questions that preceded them. They are more specific. The 2019 Glastonbury survey does not confirm that a vault sealed by Abbot Richard Whiting or his associates lies at the coordinates indicated. It confirms that something is there at 5 meters depth that does not match any known feature of the Abbey's ground plan, and that the something is real and documentable and warrants targeted excavation. The confirmation of what it is belongs to the excavation that has been recommended and not yet authorized. This is where the record currently rests. It rests in the technical language of survey reports and excavation summaries and dendrochronology analyses and the controlled vocabulary of peer-reviewed journals. It rests in archives that are accessible to researchers and to anyone patient enough to request the relevant files. The material is there. The questions it generates are there. The spaces that those questions concern are sealed and still, holding their contents, whatever those contents are, in conditions of remarkable preservation, unchanged since the day the last stone was mortared into the last blocking wall, and the last person with direct knowledge of what lay behind it walked away and eventually died. There is something almost restful in the patience the evidence demonstrates. The instruments move slowly across the ground. The data is gathered and processed and published. The recommendations are made. The authorizations are sought. The sealed spaces wait without urgency, having already waited for centuries, entirely indifferent to the pace at which the scholarship above them proceeds. The cool inside them does not vary. The air inside them moves only in the slow chemical drift of limestone chemistry across geological time. The objects inside them, if objects are inside them, which the pattern of evidence at comparable sites suggests is genuinely possible, rest in whatever arrangement they were left in, undisturbed by the passing above them of everyone who has looked for them and not found them, everyone who has measured and recorded the anomalies their presence or absence creates in the instrument data, everyone who has written the reports and filed them and waited for the authorizations. The geological patience of stone is a different order of patience from the kind that human inquiry is capable of maintaining. The sealed spaces have the advantage of not needing the inquiry to proceed. They will be there when it does. The rectangular anomaly in the 2019 Glastonbury survey sits at its coordinates, 5 meters down, clean edged in the color data, its dimensions measured and recorded. The blocked doorway at Roche was opened and found to contain what it was found to contain: the iron fittings, the corroded metal, the evidence of chests once present and now reduced to their structural hardware. The subchapter house space at the unnamed East Midlands site holds its arrangement of fragments on the floor, in the dark, the ceiling curving above them, the door blocked from outside, the excavation ongoing. The fountain's anomaly returns its signal from below the solarium floor, where the farming families of the Skell Valley have been saying for 3 generations that a lower cellar exists. The geophysical survey conducted independently confirms a feature in the same area. The English Heritage Research Report records the anomaly and the recommendation, but the authorization is pending. At Whitby, on the cliff above the North Sea, the English Heritage Research Report 8/2001 records anomalies in the northern range. The Abbey ruins above them have been eroded by North Sea weather for centuries, the walls still standing, the window tracery still holding its shape against the sky, the interior exposed to the air since the roof came down after the dissolution. Below the exposure, in the ground that the weather has not reached, the instrument readings indicate features that the known ground plan does not account for. The reports are filed, the coordinates are recorded, the grass grows, the light moves across the grass in its daily arc, and the sealed spaces beneath hold their particular stillness, their particular cold, their particular undisturbed quality, unchanged, not because nothing has changed above them, but because the earth above them has been, for all practical purposes, an adequate seal, and the stone around them was built to last. The vault beneath the ancient abbey, not any single vault now, but the category of vault that the modern investigative record has established as real and recurring across these sites, holds something. At Roche, it held corroded iron fittings and unidentifiable metal. At the unnamed East Midlands site, it holds fragmented liturgical objects on an undisturbed floor. At Glastonbury's southeastern precinct, it holds the unidentified rectangular feature at 5 meters that the 2019 survey recorded and that excavation has not yet resolved. At Fountains, it holds whatever the solarium floor sits above in the area where the geophysical anomaly and the family memory converge. The record is specific about this much, about what lies within the specific sealed spaces that the instruments have reached but excavation has not yet confirmed. The record is silent, as it has always been, in the way that sealed spaces are silent, completely.